everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. We're so happy to have you join us for the second annual conference of the MEI Cyber Program. My name is Eliza Campbell, and I'm an associate founding director of the program and a fellow. I'm very happy to welcome you to our first session today, which is going to focus on democracy, gender, and expression online, and the state of Middle East civil society today. So it's been about a decade since the Arab uprisings brought into sharper focus a series of burgeoning movements for democracy, transparency, and human rights throughout the Middle East. Social media definitely played an essential role in facilitating the protests, catching some political leaders off guard by providing a more robust space for international attention to the voices and narratives of underrepresented and vulnerable groups in these movements, including women and LGBTQ populations. In response, however, many governments have tightened their grips on cyberspace and onto the technology arena in order to tame the threat and help to neutralize opposition and expression, including through fake news laws, so-called immorality laws, online internet shutdowns, surveillance, and social media campaigns. This panel, which I'm hoping will cover all of this and more, will reflect on some of these changes and explore the state of contemporary civil society in the Middle East, including how it intersects with gender equality, political organizing, and journalism in the region, as well as what challenges and opportunities exist for the future. So as you may be able to tell, we're going to hope to cover a lot of complex and ambitious ground today. So I'm very happy and excited to have two excellent panelists with us today who will help us to work through some of this and make sense of this complex series of topics. First off, we have joining us Dr. Sahar Khamis, who is an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland College Park and an expert on Arab and Muslim media, as well as a non-resident at the cyber program at MEI. She's the author of numerous publications tackling cyber activism and cyber feminism in the MENA region, including her co-edited book, Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions. Besides writing on the relationship between online communication, gender, and civil society, she's a frequent media commentator on these topics, so we're really happy to have her with us. And please join me also in welcoming Meher Nadim. Meher is a journalist and contributing writer at Rest of World, which is a new publication that reports on technology issues impacting the global south and other regions. And she's also reported for Reuters, Bloomberg News, and Lebanon's Daily Star. Recently, her work has focused on the issues at the intersection of technology, civil society, and human rights in the Middle East, including a really excellent deep dive into the rise of the chat app Clubhouse in Saudi Arabia, which I have to recommend if you all haven't read it to take a look at. So to start off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists who are approaching these issues from very kind of different but intersecting approaches to give maybe some quick opening remarks in about 7 to 10 minutes of kind of an overview of how you see this series of questions playing out, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of this pivot all of our lives to more participation in the online space. So I'm going to go to Sahar first, and after that, we'll go into some questions and hopefully some audience questions as well.
Thank you so much, Eliza, for this great introduction. It's always a pleasure and an honor to participate in all the events of MEI, which are always excellent and very stimulating. So I would like to really tackle three very important moments that had a big impact on women in the MENA region, and specifically, of course, in the Arab world. The Arab Spring moment, and the Me Too moment, and the COVID-19 moment. These are three very important moments that had a huge impact on women. And in tackling these issues, I would like to highlight the limitations as well as the double-edged sword effect of cyber activism and cyber feminism. So basically, when the Arab Spring erupted 10 years ago, we are now celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring uprisings. Definitely, there was this kind of quote-unquote techno-euphoria. People were very euphoric about, the change coming to the region, democratization, transformation. And yes, women activists were also very much excited about the potential that this could have for women's activism, cyber feminism, and also gender equity in the region. 10 years forward, we're obviously seeing a lot of the unfulfilled promises of the Arab Spring uprisings in the political scheme. We have seen how there has been a derailing of democratization or the transition to democracy in the so-called quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries. And I would say the same could be said, unfortunately, about women's activism and about cyber feminism and about women's rights in the region. With the unique exception of Tunisia, which has been also the exception in terms of a smoother transition to democratization, many of the Arab Spring countries did not really witness the needed or the desired or hoped for transformation in democratization and political reform. Neither did they witness this also in the realm of women's rights. And there's a reason for that. I always say women's rights can never be seen as something which is divorced from or put aside from or separate from the overall development in a country. We cannot expect a backlash in democratization and reform and expect to see some kind of positive change when it comes to women's rights, for a very simple reason, because women are half of society and they give birth to the second half, right? And they are part and parcel of every society. So if you're going to see a backlash in human rights, and you're going to see more violations of human rights, and you're going to see a backlash in terms of democratization and a derailment of the process of transforming to democratization, it is only logical and normal to expect that this is going to impact and affect women in so many negative ways. But women also have an added layer of gender bias, right? And a lot of inequities when it comes to their own social rights. So they were part and parcel of the Arab Spring uprisings. They played heroic roles, like really, really heroic roles, being at the front lines of resistance, risking their own lives, being killed and martyred, being, tortured, arrested, you name it. They faced all types of harassment. Sometimes they ended up being refugees, and they really paid a big price for their own activism. Unfortunately, there is this mindset that once the uprisings are quote unquote seen as over, whether this is because the top of the regime has been changed, as we have seen in the case of Egypt, or the case of Libya or some of the Arab Spring countries, or whether because it has been crushed or silenced, as we have seen in the case of Bahrain, whatever the case is, women are told, thank you so much, ladies, you've done your part, now it's time for you to go to the kitchen, maybe you can go to the hair salon, do your nails. So basically they are brushed aside and they're not taken seriously. And one example, for example, in Egypt, when women thought, oh, now we had this golden Arab Spring moment, let's really capitalize on it and go out to Tahrir Square and start to have a momentum. Let's have a big demonstration to call for women's rights. Maybe we can have 1 million women march. Only 500 women showed up and they were basically shouted at and screamed at, like, this is not the time to do it. Just go home, go to the hair salon. We don't want you to do this kind of noise. We need to build our country. Of course, this is a huge mistake, because building a country can never take place without involving women and being at the table and taking decisions that really matter to their own lives. But that has been a pattern, unfortunately, that we have been witnessing in the MENA region, and I'm afraid in many other parts of the world as well. Not to mention, of course, the fact that regimes themselves have been building their own learning curves in terms of cracking down on opposition. So women who were activists and opponents of the regimes, many of them ended up, either completely leaving the political scene, stopping their political blogging, stopping their political activism online and offline, or they ended up in exile or in jail, which is, of course, a very grim and gloomy picture. But again, that impacted both women and men activists in the region, and unfortunately was one of the unhoped for or undesired outcomes of the so-called Arab Spring uprisings, which of course created all of these mixed effects, which were mostly, unfortunately, negative for women in the region. Moving to the COVID-19 moment, we have seen how there are big disparities, what we call the digital divide, between the technological haves and have-nots in many parts of the world. These digital divides become particularly more clear and more obvious when you're talking about less developed countries, where there is more risks of having illiteracy, especially, of course, among women. That is no secret that the rates of illiteracy are higher among women compared to men in the MENA region and the Arab world. Specifically, if you go to villages or remote areas or rural areas, the percentages will be even higher and higher, meaning that these women already have the disadvantage of alphabetical illiteracy, let alone digital illiteracy as well. Of course, there is also the lack of access to resources, the lack of access to infrastructure, to technology, to internet connectivity. We cannot assume that people have 24/7 high-speed internet in every part of the world. That is simply not true. So the digital divide is very much alive and well, but it becomes exacerbated and really exaggerated and much more clear in the case of the gender digital divide, where women become really more at disadvantage of getting access to information and being online because of all of these barriers: infrastructure, technology, digital illiteracy, remoteness, unavailability of technology. All of these factors together create this huge and big divide. Also, you think about the pandemic, how it impacted the educational system, and women, many of them not being able to go to school. Well, guess what? Unfortunately, the bad news is many of them will not return back to school even after life goes back to normal. In traditional conservative societies, there is more of a preference for sending, the boys to school rather than girls. So many of these girls are going to really fall behind in the educational system. Many of them end up being the caretakers for the family. They will end up having more children, getting married early, not exactly the kind of future that was hoped for before the pandemic. And the digital divide and the gender digital divide made things even worse for these women. You look at the Me Too movement, and of course, we know that the hashtag Me Too movement started in the US, it started to go viral, and it started to spread to other parts of the world. The MENA region and the Arab world is no exception. Some young women took to social media and took to digital media in order to amplify their voices and make their voices heard when it comes to issues like sexual harassment, being rape victims. They started to create some kind of uproar and some kind of awareness online. We have seen, for example, in the case of Egypt, the young girl, Nadine Ashraf, who is the 22-year-old college student at the time, who started the anonymous Instagram account at Assault Police, which started to attract hundreds of thousands of followers. And she started to talk about this young man, Ahmed Bassem Zaki, and how he has harassed her, harassed many women. And the case started to go viral, with many, many more women starting to come forward and talk, not just about this particular person, but about other incidents of sexual harassment that they faced in their own lives. And it started to create this kind of ripple effect, or this kind of triggering effect, that really more and more women became emboldened. Also, the infamous case of the Fairmont Hotel, the five-star hotel in Cairo, where a young woman came out and said on social media that she was drugged and raped, and the case started to really go viral. Unfortunately, however, just recently, 4 of the suspects in this particular case were released under the claim of quote-unquote insufficient evidence, creating again another uproar online, this time under the hashtag justice for the Fairmont victim. What I want to say here is that even in this case, unfortunately, we have also seen limitations. We have also seen the double-edged sword effect of social media, because unfortunately, although there was an uproar and it went viral and created awareness about an issue which is important, which is sexual harassment, on the other hand, we did not see the desired change. And the same could be said about the Arab Spring moment, and the same could be said about any other moment that we're talking about politically or socially. Simply because social media are very important tools, but they are not magical tools. They will not bring about change and transformation politically or socially all by themselves. We need an overall comprehensive approach to change and transformation if we are to see some kind of improvement and change in this region, politically, socially, economically, or legally. You need to have a holistic and comprehensive approach. And unless this is really put in place, you cannot really expect to see huge differences or huge transformations, whether in the political scene or the social scene or the legal scene or any other scene in the MENA region. So just like these examples I just mentioned now, the Arab Spring movement, the COVID-19, and the Me Too movement, and of course, I'm sure there's going to be much more discussion about that in the Q&A, it did show us the potential of social media and digital media, what cyber activism can do, what cyber feminism can do. It can open new doors, it can create awareness, it can trigger public opinion, but it cannot bring about change all by itself, because you do need to have an active and vibrant civil society. You need to have NGO organizations. You need to have opposition movements. You need to have an organized women's movement to work at the grassroots level. And yes, you need to have new laws and new regulations. And all of these things are, unfortunately, up till this moment, are not really put in place in the correct and accurate and comprehensive way. Therefore, we cannot really say that we were able to achieve the desired for results in all of these areas and arenas. The change is on the way. I think we need to be optimistic to see the hopeful or the bright side of things, but we also need to definitely acknowledge the limitations and the double-edged sword effect of social media in all of these realms and domains as well. So I'll stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I think that's a really, really excellent kind of summing up of, and I really appreciate this framing of kind of these 3 big crystallizing moments, which I think especially in the context of, us living in the US or kind of working from an international perspective, it's really interesting to see how these kind of 3 different moments were perceived or experienced differently, and how these kind of inflection points can help us to understand the changes that come in their wake. So with that, let's go to Meher. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Eliza, for having me here today. I'm incredibly excited and honored to be here with Sahar. For those of you guys who might not know me, I'm Meher, and I'm a reporter covering the intersection of technology and politics in Iran and Saudi Arabia for the last year. Um, I was born to Pakistani parents in London, but I spent most of my life growing up in Riyadh. So I'm super excited to be speaking about Saudi a little bit later today. But I think we should start probably with the Iranian elections that are happening this month. And I'd love to just talk about what we're observing. As a brief overview, Hassan Rouhani has been serving as president for the last 8 years, since 2013, and has completed his 2 term limits. And so we're going to see a new face leading Iran soon. The elections have the farce of being sort of like vaguely democratic in that Iranian citizens do place a vote in a ballot box, but largely the elections are determined by the supreme leader. And the reason I wanted to bring up the Iranian elections up today is because, and why they're so incredibly fascinating to me from a technology perspective is because of how deeply intertwined internet rights and the rights and the issue of internet freedom is to ordinary Iranians and to the Iranian elections. Now, if for American elections, the top issue is immigration and racial policies or taxation, for Iranians, one of the key issues is the internet. And that's what makes Iran sort of like a fascinating case study. And this sort of conversation between national elections and the internet is not a recent phenomenon in Iran. And we can trace this back to some years even before the Arab Spring, to the Green Movement of 2009. So in 2009, during the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the authorities blocked Facebook in the country a few weeks prior when he was elected. People said there was a fraud election, and mass protests erupted across the country. Consequently, there was a retaliation and violent suppression from the Iranian government, and Iranians turned at that point in 2009 to the internet. So the local sites, as well as Twitter and places like MySpace, to upload testimonies of the brutalities that were being enforced on them. And I think that this moment was a sort of a watershed moment in recent Iranian history, because it shaped the lens by which Iranian people understand the capabilities of the internet. Namely, that's to say that Iranians view the internet as a means and an asset to keep their regime accountable, a means to communicate their experience and to demand justice of sorts. And as a result, consecutive Iranian governments have had a troubled relationship between maintaining the control over their own narratives and their control on the internet. So if we were to bring this back to the current day, I think what this election is capturing precisely is like this, this tense relationship between governments and the internet. Now, Hassan Rouhani was actually elected in 2013 as a moderate figure on the very basis that he was someone that would promise people a freer access to the internet, that he would offer more liberal access to the internet. And he said in his campaigns that he would not restrict his people, he would not, filter sites or filter apps or block places. But despite this, over the last 8 years, this government is responsible for blocking the vast majority of foreign sites and for the near completion of what's known as the National Information Network, or the Halal Internet. So the Halal Internet, for people who might not know, is a term used for the domestic Iranian internet, which has been created for its population, completely censored of sort of foreign content and completely controlled by the government. The only real parallel to Iran is probably Russia and China, that has a similar internet. And I think it's a good point to note that like US-led sanctions against Iran have only had the effect of, aligning like China-Iranian cooperation on the National Information Network. So the NIN began with this narrative that it was simply protecting its citizens by cleansing the internet from harmful anti-Islamic content. Sort of the same narrative that countries like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia use to block pornography sites. But NIN has ventured out to be a means of complete control for the government. And the most glaring indication of how incredibly successful that this government has been in doing this was in the internet shutdown following the anti-government protests in 2019, right before the COVID-19 pandemic. So in November of 2019, with inflation and unemployment soaring in the country, people came out all across Iran in the biggest and arguably the most violent protests in recent history. So anecdotally, more so than the Green Movement. And the government, in its response, shut down the internet. So unlike 2009, for more than 7 days, it was impossible for Iranians to communicate on the internet, both inside or outside. And as the government brutally suppressed protesters, gathering them from their houses and imprisoning them, there was no way that Iranians could communicate with each other or people outside. Now, internet shutdowns have become an increasingly common phenomenon as authoritarian sort of tendencies sort of creep up around the world. But I think the Iranian study is fascinating because it shows sort of how well the regime has done in succeeding in controlling the internet, almost as if it was a commodity, as if it was water or electricity, in that it can literally turn the internet off at the flick of a switch, right? So given that the COVID-19 pandemic hit Iran sort of very strongly and very early on, Iranians were placed under pandemic lockdowns pretty soon, right after sort of the 2019 brutal shutdown. And I think the shadow of that brutal experience was fresh for many and remains sort of in present memory even today. So for that reason, I suspected early on in 2020 that maybe the Iranian elections would be sort of less disputed, that the conversations would be narrower. But I think what's really changed the dynamic in the last 2 or 3 months is the emergence of Clubhouse and the arrival of Clubhouse in the conversation. Now, I do want to steer away from making it sound as if like Clubhouse is like bringing democracy into Iran or any of that stuff, because it's not. I agree with Sahar that we need to be sort of like level-headed about what social media and the capabilities of these apps. Especially because Clubhouse is an Apple platform in a country where people aren't allowed to buy Apple iPhones because of sanctions, and it's an Android majority country. But what I do think it is that I think it's an incredibly unique platform that's given people an arena to communicate where there are very few options otherwise. So, Instagram is sort of the only other major foreign social media network in Iran that isn't blocked. And after November 2019, we also saw how Instagram became, a place for political expression. But Instagram isn't particularly suited for discussion or debate or longer form content because it's a visual platform. And that's sort of where, the arena that Clubhouse is sort of filling up. And also, as I reported, like the government sort of placed like citizen informers on Instagram, and that expression was strangled on that platform. Clubhouse and the fact that it sort of arrived at a time right before the elections when it would be politically unsavvy for anyone in power to block the app means that it's really blown up. It's unlike Clubhouse is unlike in Iran is unlike anything I've seen in any other country. That is to say that like you have political candidates, the presidential candidates for the election up until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the night, talking with ordinary Iranians and engaging in debate. It's become sort of the arena of the election. Joe Biden doesn't even tweet his own tweets, but you have Mohammed Zarif, talking about his foreign policy issues and answering questions at 2 a.m. in the morning. So I do think it's really remarkable. I mean, one particular example that I do want to bring up is the case of how Clubhouse has offered, even though the elections are sort of pre-marked by the supreme leader, it has given a voice to reformist figures. So, for example, you have Mustafa Tojzadeh. And Mustafa Tojzadeh is as spoken as he gets. He was a candidate for the presidential election, but he was stripped of, running anymore. And he was a former minister of interior who was imprisoned in Evin prison, which is the most notorious prison in Iran, for over 8 years for collusion against the regime and his participation in the Green Movement. And yet he remained sort of steadfast in his criticism. And a day after announcing his run for presidency, he was on Clubhouse answering questions about the app and why he was running. And Clubhouse is actually allowing Tojzadeh to air sort of what would be considered sort of blasphemous views in other contexts. So, for example, he's saying, I don't want the supreme leader to be, a lifetime job. I think it should be a presidential sort of gig where the lifetime is 4 to 5 years for a supreme leader. And these views are very controversial. And it's unheard that these kinds of views would be being aired to, thousands at a time in Iran through the app. So I think what it's, for Tojzadeh, it's allowed this expression, and for a lot of other reformists who are getting this chance on Clubhouse. Now, that's not to say that like Telegram in the last election, that these reformers after the election will not be imprisoned or persecuted for the views that they are expressing. But right now, you do have this window where people are finding a way to cleanse themselves of political anger, to ask for accountability, and to have a conversation when other media forms and other networks and other social media thing has really tightened over the last couple of years. So while Iranian elections are still undemocratic, and I think that we just need to give credit where credit is due, and that these kinds of conversations are happening with ordinary Iranians in the aftermath of November 2019, and that's pretty remarkable. So talking about Clubhouse brings me a little bit to Saudi Arabia, and I just wanted to sort of touch on how Saudi Arabia has sort of dealt with Clubhouse. Clubhouse has had a jump in popularity in Saudi Arabia as well. And I think for Saudi, Clubhouse came at a time when sort of the country has been transforming rapidly for the last couple of years, and it's a country sort of in flux and processing flux. Growing up in Riyadh, especially as a woman, I think it's hard to communicate what the experience of coming to age was like to people outside. But the country has, rapidly changed under MBS. Every single time I came back, I was in college during when MBS came to power. Every single time I went back, I was really taken aback by the changes that were happening, especially for women. So, when I was in high school, restaurants were segregated. There was a singles area for men, and there was a families area for women. Music wasn't allowed. I was petrified of being in a car with any guy who wasn't, blood related to me, even though I went to a co-ed international school because of the laws that existed there. But if you look at Saudi Arabia now, it's really changing. Women are entering the workforce. There's a cultural and value mindsets are changing, and women are driving, and just there's a radical shift. And I think Saudi Arabia is giving them Clubhouse, and this expression is allowing people to translate and to communicate their feelings about all this change, which has been radical in the last couple of years. I think I would also note that Saudi Arabia is an incredibly private society, and for girls and boys to be talking about issues like female employment, driving, and alcohol is astounding. I also think that Saudi Arabia is an interesting counterexample to Iran, because under MBS, who is very tech savvy and wants to be seen as a leader of the future, who's in tune and aligned with the vision of tomorrow. Like, Saudi Arabia does not have the policy of blocking apps like Iran does. There wasn't the fear that Clubhouse would be banned or that it would be blocked, because I think Saudi Arabia is a little bit more tech savvy, and it also knows that the memory and the continued lived experience of self-censorship runs very strongly in the country. So, for example, I think Iranian Clubhouse is very, very political, but in Saudi Arabia, those political conversations are much more gentle. The only time I didn't sort of see that was shortly after women's rights activist Lujain al-Hathlul was released from prison. And I saw briefly a moment where people were talking, but that conversation was shut down because of how self-enforcing censorship is, because of the customs and the experiences that most Saudis continue to live with. I think I'll pause here because I think I've spoken a bit, but I guess I'll give the floor back to Eliza for any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Meher. I think I'm really happy that you brought up the cases of Iran and Saudi Arabia, because in many ways, these two countries are sort of like the, I guess, main test cases in the region for how technology will intersect with popular democracy movements and also with women's role in them. And many countries in the region kind of take their cues from one or the other, or for both. And I think it shows that increasingly in governments that are taking, inspiration from more authoritarian style governments, there will be kind of sharing of tactics when it comes to either, clamping down on technology's use. And in particular, as Sahar mentioned, kind of saying to women like, well, it's all fine and good if you drive traffic for us, if you get us attention. Or in the case of the companies themselves, saying it's all good and fine if you make us look like, we as Facebook are helping democracy in the Middle East or whatever. But when it comes to being accountable, when it comes to actually following through on concrete reforms that make people's lives safer, so good luck. So kind of on that note, kind of with the specific cases that you both have raised, which I think are really great, kind of concrete examples of how to think about these really broad issues. I'm going to go to Sahar. So you've written extensively about the unique role played by women in the media and in journalism in the Middle East, and particularly how movements have sometimes been taken advantage of in some of these movements, while also, women have gained a lot of attention in some cases as journalists or as activists on social media platforms, while sometimes being subject to special kinds of abuses or trolling or hate speech that men activists in the same space just really aren't. How has this space changed in your estimation in the past couple of years? And what are some unique threats and opportunities faced by women in the region who are working as journalists or who are trying to draw attention to the space for civil society and political reform?
Thank you so much, Eliza. Before I go into answering your question, I just want to make a quick remark on something that Meher said about shutdowns when she was talking about shutdowns in Iran. So immediately I remembered the experiences of shutdowns during the Arab Spring, right, in Egypt and Syria and other countries. So we've seen, for example, the shutting down of the internet, so-called, just pulling down the kill switch, as they call it, in Egypt, when the country went in a complete blackout for a total, complete 1 week without internet and without cell phone connectivity. And of course, it completely backfired and had completely negative effects on the country in terms of even having greater on the street mobilization and people flooding the streets and going out in bigger numbers. And then other countries were watching and learning, building their own learning curves. So you see a country like Syria that did not shut down the internet for an entire week but only, for example, on Thursday night and Friday, when people are most likely to go out to the street and protest, to minimize the kind of negative impact or backfiring that happened in the Egyptian case, and to also minimize the kind of negative impact on the economy that was witnessed in the Egyptian case. So I just wanted to draw this kind of parallel or this kind of comparison because it came to mind when Meher was talking about the shutdowns in Iran. Now, at your question, I think that when we talk about women, we also have to talk about women in different capacities, right? There are women who are activists, there are women who are, in opposition, there are women who are journalists, and indeed, many of these women did gain visibility and did gain some more platforms to speak and to make their voices louder and to make their messages more amplified, thanks to technology and thanks to the availability of the internet. And again, cyber activism and cyber feminism did play a very important role in terms of allowing or enabling these women to reach out and to amplify their voices. There is no question about it. But also, on the other hand, we also have to be quite mindful of some of the downsides and some of the negative impacts and effects that were also created because of these very particular momentums and these particular mechanisms, because of their visibility and because of their accessibility and because of their increasing public presence and increased visibility online. That also attracts sometimes quote unquote unwanted attention, in the sense that they can become easy targets for certain regimes. The regimes can go after them, they can face trolling, they can have they can be trolled online, they can face online harassment, which is a real threat. And in some severe cases, of course, just like their male counterparts, they can even become threatened physically, and they can go to jail, or they can even be killed. And we have seen cases like that all throughout the entire MENA region. I mean, in many parts of the Arab world, in particular in the aftermath of the Arab Spring uprising. But when you talk about journalists in particular, I'm glad you brought up this particular point, because we have seen some cases, for example, like Al Jazeera, anchor woman Ghada Awais, who took to social media and she started to write op-eds about how she was actually targeted because of her own views and because of her own presence and her own presenting of certain programs on Al Jazeera that some people did not agree with and did not like. And therefore, they started to use the social media or the internet as a weapon to attack her. Some people broke into her own cell phone, were able to get some of her own private photos, were able to put some of these photos online. It really became like a huge issue. And she said, I'm not gonna just stand there and take it. I'm gonna fight back, and I'm gonna make a big uproar, and I'm gonna speak about it, and I'm gonna push back, and I'm gonna fight back against this kind of unacceptable harassment. So unfortunately, because of the conservative and traditional nature of many societies in the region, women become easier targets, not just for the regular, a government is going after you type of mechanism that you also see with their male counterparts, but there's an added layer of specifically targeting women on social basis and trying to use some kind of stigmatization, shaming them or stigmatizing them, in the case of Ghada, like showing her pictures, in a swimming suit or in a spa, this kind of stuff, which is completely unacceptable, because they know that women in these conservative cultures or these more conservative societies will become easier targets for this type of stigmatization and this type of trolling on social media. But I'm also glad that women are speaking up. They're not just taking it and just being silent about it. They're also pushing back, using the very same platforms of social media and new media to amplify their messages and to make their voices heard and to say, you know what, I'm not going to let you do this to me. I'm going to speak about it. I'm going to expose you. I'm going to really push back against this type of trolling and this kind of online harassment. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as women become more enabled and have more voices and become more empowered using online tools and means of cyber activism and cyber feminism.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's such a good way to kind of frame the issue, especially going forward. So I do, at this point, want to encourage our audience, if you're listening in, to submit questions on whatever platform you're on. We have a couple from the audience so far, but this is a really kind of lively and interesting series of topics. So we're looking forward to having kind of a stimulating discussion with a lot of audience feedback. So please feel free to submit questions. So next I want to go to Meher. So you've written, as you mentioned, about the use of Instagram in Iran as kind of one of the last free platforms, or so-called free platforms in the region, or in the country rather. And kind of the role of Iranian influencers on the platform, most of whom are women, and kind of how, as the rise of the influencer, as sort of the figure around whom the entire internet is increasingly shaped, around whom advertisers kind of shape campaigns, and around whom increasingly governments and political organizers kind of make a lot of their marketing and strategies for marketing. What has been kind of what you've noticed about the changes and the fluctuations to the use of Instagram in Iran, especially when it comes to some of these women on the platform who, may rely on their livelihood and who are kind of over-policed and in some cases even censored by the platform as a result of different government sanctions or things like this?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. I started looking at Instagram shortly after the November 2019 protests, but Instagram even before then. I think given that Twitter and Facebook and most of the major social media sites are blocked. Having said that, a lot of them you do use VPN and like a lot of people get around it. But Instagram sort of was the place where like most people were, and it was a place where like you don't have to, if you're an Iranian on Twitter, you're a very political person. But Instagram was for everyone. It was for the mom. It was for your local uncle. It was for your teenager. And I think what I loved about Instagram, even removing the political from it, is that it showed sort of like the mundane reality of life in Iran, like the ordinary, the trivial. And I think that's incredibly important as well for the narrative, where news about Iran is incredibly polarized and controlled about our perceptions of it. So I think on one hand, like Instagram was a breathing ground and a breathing space for a lot of ordinary Iranians to express themselves and to share their lives. I think for young girls, I met a bunch of young girls who were aspiring fashionistas. It was so cool to see the very different way of life that they had behind in their personal lives, that they were able to show on Instagram. But after November 2019, Instagram did sort of take a political turn, and it was sort of, I mean, alongside the rise of sort of what you have in America as well, like the rise of the infographic on, popping up on Instagram, where you have people trying to explain, Black Lives Matters in like a one screenshot view. And you had that after the November 2019 protests, where they were like trying to explain like, why they were protesting, and also posting pictures and videos and testimonies of what has actually happened in the aftermath. As a result, I think that switch again, Iranian authorities are pretty, Iranians are incredibly tech savvy, and so is the Iranian government. And they're sort of like, it's this matter of like playing catch up and making sure that the Iranian government, I mean, all Iranian officials are on, blocked sites like Twitter, and they're all on it. And they found that the most effective way, I think, or one way that to reach an audience was to sort of target the mundane. So people, you had people who were just ordinary cooking bloggers, or like, they just had their family life, but they had millions of followers because people wanted to see an ordinary Iranian, or an ordinary, follower. And as a means of intimidation, I guess that, you started to, you would be called in, I guess, to the local police station and be like, I think that you should cover your head. So it sort of started with the hijab law of like, I think you should, wear hijab on the profile. And there was this idea of cleansing social media so that a woman in Iran are sanctimonious even online, that they're even wearing, that they're, cooperating with the narrative that the government is producing. So with the rise of sort of like influencers who were sort of intimidated by the government, and then you had them putting on the hijab and saying that they cooperate, and in their bio you'd have like, I believe in the laws of the Iranian government and I cooperate. And that had a trickle down effect to smaller influencers who were realizing that like either they agreed with them, some of them did, but a lot of other people realized that there wasn't the free expression that they possibly thought there was before, and that there was a clampdown. And so I definitely think that using the citizen informer, or using sort of more like more discreet tactics of how to sort of communicate your message was, is an example of how Instagram, like how the Iranian government sort of infiltrated Instagram and sort of like stifled expression through means of fear and, self-censorship again.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's really interesting to see kind of as, social use and just everyday people's use of the internet has changed. Governments have also changed their tactics and kind of knowing how to examine some of these platforms, and also taken on some of these, tactics and ways of use in kind of the crackdowns that they participate in and things like this. And I think this will continue to be a cycle. So whenever, as Sahar said 10 years ago, kind of this techno-optimism narrative was either technology is really kind of this useless, superficial thing that we should ignore, or it's the most important thing ever and it's key to democracy and all of this. It's obviously a very oversimplification that I think we're slowly kind of moving past, that it kind of is both, actually. And I think the use of Instagram really speaks to this, both in the fact that it can be really a powerful use for speech, and it can also just be a place for, memes and selfies with your cat, and why not both? So kind of on that point, I want to go to Sahar because we have a question from an audience member, Ashia, asking, do you think that social media continues to be a useful safety valve for powerful people, for authorities? And how do you think that social media could be used to bring about desired change as a tool instead of kind of like the central unit of organizing?
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question. I'll just address the first part first, which is about the safety valves, right? The safety valve mechanism was successfully used by some dictators in the region. One starking example, of course, that really stands out is Mubarak. So Hosni Mubarak for 30 years ruled Egypt for 3 decades, right? And he was using pretty much, type of safety valve mechanism whereby he would leave just a small amount of freedom for some, tame opposition party to express its views, or some tame opposition, a person or figure to express certain views as a way for allowing the public to vent or to basically express some form of frustration or some form of disappointment in order to avoid reaching some kind of a boiling moment where there is a big explosion. Of course, this worked for 30 years, but eventually the explosion happened and the moment came, and we saw the eruption of the Arab Spring, of course, uprisings that started in Tunisia and then moved on to Egypt and then to other Arab Spring countries. So it did work for some time. I'm afraid that some rulers now are not even allowing this safety valve margin anymore. They're not even allowing this small margin of freedom or expression or even tame opposition anymore. They're just clamping down more vigorously and more aggressively on all forms of opposition. We have seen that very clearly in the post-Arab Spring countries, with the unique exception of Tunisia, which really came out as the exception in the midst of all of this turmoil that followed the Arab Spring uprisings. And it did really set a successful model, both in the political as well as in the gender realm, with really good laws and legislations for women to have more rights in Tunisia compared to other countries. And guess what? That's because women are on the bench. Women are judges in Tunisia. And I'm glad that Egypt is following this path. And hopefully in October, we're supposed to have some law that allows women to be judges in Egypt. So that's a very important point. When women are, I always say, when women are at the table, they will not be on the menu, right? So when you are at the bench, that means you're going to legislate new laws and regulations that can really be gender equitable and gender sensitive, and you can change bad laws that are really insensitive to women and to women's rights and women's needs. So I believe the safety valve did work for some time, but unfortunately, I think also that, fortunately or unfortunately, that some regimes now are moving away from this even safety valve or small margin of enabling some form of opposition, and they're just clamping down more severely, which again, I'm saying fortunately and unfortunately, because on one hand, you're seeing this crackdown on civil society and activists and opponents, but on the other hand, as they say, too much pressure will speed up the process of explosion or speed up the process of rebellion. So that can be the positive side of it. The second part of the question regarding how social media can become a much more effective, not just tool, but really part and parcel of a bigger form of change, I think that change has to come at the grassroots level. One of the big lessons we learned the hard way from the Arab Spring uprisings was you cannot really make change happen just online, right? There was a group that was created in Egypt after the initial success of the Egyptian revolution with the ousting of Mubarak that said, you cannot bring change by clicking the mouse on your computer, something like that, right? It was a very long name for a group, obviously, but the message was clear. You cannot bring about change and reform just by sitting behind your computer screen. And it's very true. Unless you have change at the grassroots level, unless you have an active and vibrant civil society, unless you have organized NGOs, unless you have some margin of freedom of expression online and offline, social media alone, as I said before, really is not a magical tool, and it cannot bring about change and reform and transformation all by itself. Having said all of that, I also want to say a very important point, which is we do not have, quote unquote, what we can describe as a one size fits all. This is a very important point. As we have seen when we talk about the MENA region, the Arab world, right, post-Arab Spring countries, we have to be careful and we have to be cautious because, again, we have to be sensitive to some of the differences, some of the distinctions, some of the similarities, but also some of the differences between some of these countries, whether if we're talking about political transformation or political change, or if we are talking about social transformation and women's rights and gender rights, right? Just like I gave the example of Tunisia, Tunisia being a more successful model in terms of both political transformation and also social transformation and gender rights and gender equity, we cannot put it in the same package or the same parcel and say, you know, this is the model or this is the example, or other countries exactly have to follow the same path in the exact same way, or all countries had the same outcome. Obviously, the outcomes are so different. The outcomes, there's a big discrepancy in terms of all of these results, and we have to be sensitive in terms of the similarities as well as the differences and the discrepancies, and not to put everyone in the same basket or to use a one-size-fits-all approach, whether in terms of cyber activism or in terms of cyber feminism. We have to contextualize all of that within the specific socio-political context in every and each country in the MENA region and in the Arab world. That's a very important point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sahar. I can always count on you to take something extremely complicated and make it seem both very simple and somehow more complicated, but also inspire me to take action at the same time. So we have another audience question from Laura. And so I'm going to just read that, and then we can sort of take that as a group, I think. So Laura asks, can proponents of democratic governance abroad in the policy world, in civil society, and or in the private sector, how can they use or shape technology in a way that's supportive of the rights of women and all internet users in the region? Or is the premise of the question wrong? Would that be seen as unhelpful meddling on the parts of powers that be? And should we be considering means other than the technological? So Sahar, do you want to offer some thoughts? I also have a couple of my own, and then we'll go to Meher after that.
Right. I mean, this question really reminds me of the whole debate and the whole discussion about the notion of quote unquote collectivism and slacktivism, right? When people say, oh, you know, you're just using social media, you're not doing anything on the ground, maybe you are just engaging in quote unquote collectivism or slacktivism. Well, guess what? Sometimes using online communication is the only means or the only tool which is available. If you look, for example, at Syria, and you look at the case of Syrian activists, right? And you look at the case of Syrian women who became refugees, or women who are activists online trying to raise awareness about issues related to the horrific humanitarian crisis in Syria and the condition, for example, of women who did become refugees themselves and really are displaced from their own country, or women who face harassment and all types of human rights challenges. They really do not have a platform except social media and online communication. That's the only platform which is available to them, right? They cannot go back to Syria. They cannot be in their own home country. They cannot work on the ground. And, even if they can hypothetically go back, which is not the case, right? They're going to face, horrendous and tremendous, obstacles and challenges in terms of their own personal safety and the safety of their own families. So the online communication here becomes the only platform which is available for them. And that's applicable to many cases of opposition in the diaspora, whereby these diasporic opposition communities only have social media and new media as the tool to communicate with the rest of the world and to raise awareness about their own issues, whether in the gender realm or other realms. And therefore, it would be unfair to label this as quote unquote slacktivism or collectivism, because that's the only really tool which is available to them.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really comprehensive answer to that. And I just want to offer some thoughts here myself, just to give you two a little bit of a break and also to kind of selfishly jump in on something I'm passionate about. So I've been having a conversation recently with some activists and scholars about the issue of content moderation on social media platforms, and basically how many of the very engineering decisions that are designed into the foundation of a platform or to internet-enabled tools and things like this are often kind of treated as neutral or without political bias or political consequence, frequently because they're designed by engineers who don't necessarily build politics into their thinking. And I think part of this is sort of the issue that we need to deal with kind of at its root, is thinking about the fact that every tool that we place in the hands of people will inherently become political if it isn't already. And that treating each tool as kind of neutral or, centered for the average user, there is no average user. And when you say average, usually you mean like a young white guy living in San Francisco. So I think to center it that way really takes away the power from understanding and looking deeply into how these dynamics play themselves out in different parts of the world, particularly where, Sahar, as you mentioned, tech access is a different issue. And I think this is one reason why Meher's reporting and the reporting done at Rest of World has been so interesting to me, and I think so crucial to this conversation, is it sheds light on ways that these platforms and different types of technology are used that generally 99% of people sitting in a big city in the US or anywhere in the US, or, a couple miles away from the headquarters of these companies wouldn't have thought of. So I guess I'll just say that when it comes to even designing the very use cases and the rules that govern use of these platforms, including on things like Twitter, where there's been, reports and repeated kind of research into the disproportionate hate speech and trolling that are faced by women, people of color, LGBTQ people, that generally hasn't been taken very seriously, unfortunately. There needs to be a deeper understanding that these are issues that are part of the platform themselves, that are baked into them. They're not something that we can treat as separate from the source. And this is all the more important, as Sahar says, in contexts where free media doesn't exist. So essentially, if your platform is functioning as critical infrastructure, essential infrastructure for a context, which is often the case, these companies and these platforms need to take that role seriously and be held accountable. So I'll just stop there. And Meher, we're glad to see you back with us. And we have a question actually that I'm hoping you might find interesting, and I think is a good kind of intersection here. So from Zayreen, we have the question about MBS and about kind of his rule and different policies in Saudi. So Saudi is often criticized for kind of having superficial policies when it comes to women, kind of these like surface level changes that maybe don't extend down or have kind of long-term political saliency. Although it's good to know, as you mentioned, that there are some ways that things are changing very slowly over time in significant ways. And to what extent can we see these kind of superficial changes, especially when it comes to the tech sector, as harbingers of things to come? And how can, maybe in the tech sector, which is an increasingly part of the Saudi economy, as you've written about, can we make sure that this, something that's essentially big business at the heart of it, kind of grapple more with the accountability to more sectors of society and especially to women who are kind of underrepresented in this field?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, before I start this question, I wanted to say that my reporting and my experience is obviously off the ground, but I understand and like my limitations in the sectors that I'm interacting with. So I'm talking to middle class to upper class women who might have a very different experience to sort of lower class women or women from minority groups or women from different sort of like different sects in Saudi Arabia. So my reporting and my answer is limited from that bias and that lens. Having said that, I think honestly, my opinion is that there's a long way to go for women to be seen as equal. That we're not anywhere near there at all. What I can say is that there is a change. I'm not sure how to talk about it in terms of how much we've done or how much is left, because I think we should constantly be challenging our societies and our governments to be doing more and to be pushing ourselves. So I don't think you should take the criticism away from the government, from MBS, or to say that, yeah, this is enough, like that this is fine. Having said that, I think that the most remarkable thing is actually being a more substantial change, which is that most of the people that I know who are women are entering the workforce. And that's a huge part of MBS's current policies about putting youth into employment, but also women into employment. And before, the time that I grew up, the only jobs that really women you see them working at was maybe like some secretarial jobs in like public offices, but mainly it was like lingerie shops or very, very limited avenues for women to work. And I think that that has been the biggest change, that women are being encouraged to go into offices and to do that. And I think that's especially true with the rise of the startup culture in Saudi Arabia. So I think if more public government buildings are still a little bit resistant to allowing women into the workforce or allowing them to rise up the ladder, you don't have that culture in startups. Like startup culture is really progressive. I think that most people are, a lot of women that I know have entered the startup scene because it's a new and fresh energy and a part of a new Saudi Arabia, that I think, and a new culture that's emerging. Having said that, I stand by saying that we should continue to challenge our governments and to say that more needs to be done. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think that covers it really well. And I agree with you that there, again, are some ways that we kind of have to take this seriously from an employment perspective, particularly since this sector is, an area where a lot of these countries are going to continue to develop their economies, particularly as countries transition away from fossil fuels and from other sectors. And so building in that consciousness and that awareness of the role of gender and the role of, the intersectionality of tech starting now, I think is the only way to really make it work going forward. So we just have a couple minutes left. And I think what I'd like to do kind of as a last kind of lightning round for the three of us, starting with you two, is to kind of think, about your wildest dreams. If you could get a meeting with MBS, or you could get a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, or whoever your kind of influential policymaker of your choice, and enact kind of the one reform that really plagues you, that you really think about, or just one of them. I don't want to make you choose. I'm sure there's many. What would be kind of the thing you would want to tackle first, or the thing that you think is kind of the most important to get us started on? And to give you two a minute to think, I can just quickly add in something of my own. So I think probably if I were able to meet with the heads of these tech companies, where I think a lot of the power is for better or for worse kind of vested, it would be for these companies to start contributing financially to some of the commitments they've made in statements and in words to their accountability to human rights. So to start, hiring more Arabic-speaking content moderators and paying them well, to start hiring more broadly across the region, not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world that are underrepresented at the headquarters of many of these tech companies, and to really reflect that in not only kind of statements in public, but also in private behavior and behind closed doors with investors and things like that as well. So for the lightning round, I'll go to you, Sahar, and then to you, Meher.
Yeah, very quickly, I'd say my own passion would be in the area of quote unquote internet regulation, which raised a lot of controversy, a lot of debate and discussion. And up till this moment in time, as we speak, we don't have a clear solution or resolution to this very slippery slope. Because every time we talk about internet regulation, what does that mean? Who is going to regulate the internet? Who has the right to regulate this cyberspace, and to what extent, right? If you talk about regulation, you can also open the back door for governments to step in and to curb freedom of expression and to crack down on opposition and to target activists and to go after them. And if you don't have any regulation at all, you can also have online harassment, and you can have disinformation and misinformation. You can have the online trolling of activists, including women activists, as we talked about it before. All of these are real threats. I would like these all, great powers to be, or great powers that exist in the field of cyber activism and the field of also technological capacity, and big companies like Facebook and others to really get together, put their minds together, and think very seriously about this whole notion of internet regulation. Who can really come together? Who would be the elites? Who can be the people who can brainstorm and think about the best possible way forward? This cannot be an individual effort. It has to be a collective effort. And at the end of the day, I just want to say a very important point, that this whole discussion, we have to really remind ourselves that we have to come to the middle ground of cyber realism. We need to move away from the euphoria of cyber optimism, where we think that social media and new media is the end all, be all, it's going to do everything and accomplish everything, or the other undesirable extreme of the unfavorable as well, cyber pessimism, that is not important, we can brush it aside and we can do without it. We need to come to the middle ground of cyber realism, recognize the potentials and the limitations of this important cyberspace at the same moment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Meher, kind of one last thing.
I think if I was to pick one, I think right now in the context of Iran, I'd probably talk to Joe Biden about sanctions. And I say that because I think that the effect of sanctions has really hampered digital activists on the ground in Iran. Removing places like Amazon services means that a lot of tech companies inside Iran who are trying to develop platforms and apps for ordinary Iranians have to put their infrastructure on the government sites and the government networks, which is a huge cybersecurity risk, and it just compromises privacy and security and dampens the work of digital activists inside the country. So I would say I probably have a conversation with Biden about U.S. sanctions in Iran.
I think that's a good place to end. Thank you both so much, Sahar and Meher, for joining us for this discussion. I wish we could keep going for hours and hours, but yeah, we'll hope to do that in the future with continued discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And please do join us for our next session on cyber warfare and critical infrastructure in the Middle East, which will be recorded on Huva and available to you then. And